The fluorescent lights of the grocery aisle hummed, blurring the canned goods as Betty Jo laughed, a sound I hadn't heard directed at me in months. Her hand rested on another man's arm, a gentle squeeze. He returned a knowing smile. My cart, half filled with dinner, felt impossibly heavy, pinning me against the frozen peas. She saw me, her eyes flickered, then she turned back to him, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't be silly, Ed. I was just asking for directions." The grocery store incident had been a month ago. A quiet humiliation that settled deep beneath the ribcage, like a stone. It marked a distinct point. Before that, the shifts in Betty Jo had been just background noise, easily dismissed. After it, they became specific data points, cataloged and cross-referenced in my head, an accountant's relentless pursuit of discrepancies. I had been married to Betty Jo for 14 years. We lived in a house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind with trimmed lawns and children's toys left out in driveways. My work at Schmidt & Sons Accounting was precise, numbers always adding up, but at home, the figures were no longer balancing. Betty Jo, once an open book, had started adding pages I could not read. She put a password on her phone. Not a complicated one, just 4 digits, but it was new. When I asked, she said, "Just for privacy, you know." With all the spam calls, she would read a text, a quick flick of her thumb, and then the message would vanish from the screen. She developed a habit of taking her phone with her everywhere, even to the bathroom. And the calls, they would be hushed, her voice a low murmur, usually from the back porch or in the bedroom with the door just slightly ajar. The moment I entered a room, she would lower the phone, a small, startled movement, then say, "Oh, I'll call you back." She would never say who it was. I told myself it was nothing. People change, relationships ebb and flow. Betty Jo was still young. Maybe she was just finding herself, as the magazine said, but my mind worked in facts, in ledger entries that balanced to the penny. The inconsistencies pricked at me, tiny needles of doubt in a carefully constructed life. I needed evidence, something concrete to prove or disprove the unease that had taken root. The evidence arrived on a Tuesday evening, a cool September night, during my routine of sorting laundry. Betty Jo had left a pair of her blue jeans on the bathroom floor. I picked them up, the denim cool and heavy, and felt a crumple in the left front pocket. Inside was a receipt, folded twice, thin thermal paper. My fingers traced the embossed name. The Iron Horse Bar and Grill. My stomach tightened. Betty Jo never went to bars. She rarely went out without me, not since our early days. The date at the top. 3 days ago. Friday. The time. 11:45 p.m. And then the items. 2 drinks, a whiskey sour, a beer. My breath hitched. Friday. 3 nights ago. Betty Jo had told me she was working late at Walmart, helping with inventory. She had come home close to midnight, tired, saying she had fallen asleep on the couch as soon as her head hit the pillow. She smelled of the store, the faint bleach and plastic of the aisles. There was no mention of the Iron Horse. The Iron Horse was 7 miles in the opposite direction from Walmart. Betty Jo hated whiskey. Always had. A whiskey sour would make her gag. I sat down hard on the cold tile floor of the laundry room. The receipt was still in my hand, a small, damning rectangle of paper. The numbers on it, usually so clear and meaningful to me, blurred. My world, which I had always imagined as solid, precise, and calculable, began to fracture. The hum of the washing machine was a hollow drone in my ears. I remembered calling Gary, my best friend, a few weeks back, trying to articulate the gnawing feeling. "She's probably just going through something," Gary had said, his voice easy, dismissive. "You're still young, you need a reliable man." He was a decent guy, Gary, but he saw the world in broad strokes, not the minute details that now felt like 1,000 tiny cuts. He had meant well, but his words were no comfort now. This was not going through something. This was a bullet. This was an undeniable, tangible act. The receipt was the first real proof, but it connected to everything else. Her sudden interest in makeup, expensive new palettes I'd seen on the dresser, the extra loads of laundry she'd been doing, sometimes late at night, and the new underwear, lacy things in dark colors, folded neatly in her drawer. Styles I had never seen her wear. Styles she had never worn for me. Our conversations had become scripts. "How was work?" I would ask at dinner. "Fine. Just the usual," she would say, not meeting my eyes. We would sit in the small kitchen, the clink of our forks against plates the only sound. The silence between us heavy and full of unspoken words. The void was deafening. The Iron Horse receipt had been a detonation, not a loud, violent one, but a silent internal implosion. My mind, usually focused on quarterly reports and tax deadlines, shifted its meticulous attention inward. The accountant in me, the one who found solace in balance sheets and irrefutable figures, took over. Desperate to quantify the unraveling of my own life, I set up a new file on my home computer, password protected. I named it Project Echo. The spreadsheet had columns: date, time out, time in, claimed activity, actual activity, TBD, observation. I started filling it in, going back through the past 2 months. The Iron Horse receipt was the first entry in observation, stark and undeniable. The numbers quickly accumulated. Late nights, 27 inches 2 months, my spreadsheet read. Each entry backed by my memory of the dim porch light and the quiet click of the lock as she returned. New clothing purchases, $847 in 6 weeks. A figure I had painstakingly gathered from bank statements and online order confirmations from her email, cross-referencing against the items I'd seen in her closet. Time talking to me, averaging 4 minutes per day. A calculation based on a small notebook I kept by the bed, jotting down the duration of our actual conversations each evening. The number was declining steadily. The data was cold, hard, and irrefutable. It built a case, not for the IRS, but for a divorce court, or maybe just for my own sanity. I needed to show someone, to get an outside opinion on these figures. Gary was the only choice. We met at Murphy's Bar, a place we'd been going since college, a few towns over. I deliberately avoided the Iron Horse. The thought of stepping inside made my stomach clench. The air in Murphy's was thick with the smell of stale beer and fried food. I slid a printed copy of the spreadsheet across the scarred wooden table. Gary, a man who saw life through the bottom of a glass of domestic lager, picked it up. He squinted at the neat columns, the precise figures. "What's this, Ed?" he asked, taking a sip of his beer. His brow furrowed as he read. I waited, watching his face. He got to the Iron Horse Bar and Grill entry, then to whiskey sour and beer. His eyes widened. He looked up at me, his usual easy smile gone, replaced by a look of genuine concern. "Jesus Christ, Ed," he said, pushing the paper back toward me slightly. "This isn't a tax audit. This is your marriage." I gripped my glass, the ice cold against my palm. "Numbers don't lie, Gary," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the tremor in my chest. "People lie. Receipts tell the truth." Gary ran a hand through his thinning hair. He'd been my friend since 9th grade algebra, the kind of friend who knew exactly how my mind worked. "So what are you going to do about it?" he asked, leaning forward, his voice low. "Confront her?" I shook my head slowly. "Not yet. I need proof. Real proof." The receipt was a good start, but it could be explained away, twisted. A friend's forgotten jacket, a quick stop on the way home, a mistaken receipt. My accountant's mind needed more. It needed undeniable, photographic, in-person proof. The terrifying question resonated in the quiet spaces of my brain. What do you do when you prove your worst fears are true? What then? The thought was a lead weight, but my compulsion to know, to truly understand the data, was stronger than the fear of the answer. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years of employment at Schmidt & Sons. I called in sick. Stomach bug. I mumbled into the phone to my boss. "Mr. Henderson," my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. It was a lie, a small, necessary one. The guilt pricked at me. But it was nothing compared to the other guilt. The feeling of invading Betty Jo's privacy. I packed a cooler with a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. I put a worn baseball cap on my head, one of Pops's old ones. I felt like a character in a cheap novel, the kind with lurid covers and predictable plots. I got into Pop's old Ford Ranger, the one he'd left me, faded blue paint and a persistent rattle in the muffler. It wasn't inconspicuous, but it was mine, and it started every time. I drove out to the Walmart, not to park in the main lot, but across the street, in the far corner of the mostly empty parking lot of a defunct hardware store. I had picked up a pair of binoculars at Target yesterday, small black ones with decent magnification. They sat on the passenger seat, new eyes for a truth I increasingly dreaded. The air in Pop's old Ranger was still, heavy with the scent of old vinyl and my own apprehension. The Walmart parking lot stretched out before me, a familiar landscape of consumerism, now a stage for my unfolding fears. I kept the binoculars close, my gaze fixed on the employee entrance. I watched her through the binoculars. Betty Jo's shift began at 9, and she parked her Honda Civic in the employee lot, always in the same spot, near the back fence. I watched her walk in, her blue vest a bright familiar splash against the gray concrete. For the next 8 hours, I stayed there, occasionally taking a sip of coffee from my thermos, unwrapping my sandwich only when the hunger became a dull ache. My eyes were glued to the entrance, sometimes sweeping across the entire lot, looking for anything out of place. Nothing, just the slow rhythm of cars coming and going, families loading groceries, teenagers loitering. At precisely 5:30 p.m., I saw her emerge from the employee entrance. She clocked out right on schedule. My heart gave a little jolt. This was it, the moment I had been dreading and yet desperately needed to witness. Instead of heading for the exit and the familiar route home, she walked directly to her Honda Civic. She opened the door, got in, and for 10 minutes, she remained inside, hidden from my view by the tinted windows. When she reappeared, she was a different woman. Gone were the practical blue vest and the sensible khaki pants. In their place, she wore a black crop top, exposing a sliver of her midriff, and tight, dark jeans that hugged her figure. Her hair, usually pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, now fell in flowing waves around her shoulders. Her face, usually just a touch of mascara and lipstick for work, was made up. Her eyes defined with liner, her lips a deeper, more vibrant shade. She looked like someone from a magazine, not the Betty Jo who folded laundry beside me on Tuesday evenings. My heart pounded, a heavy, dull thump against my ribs. I started the Ranger, the old engine catching with a familiar roar. I pulled out of the hardware store lot, giving her a wide berth, keeping several cars between us. She drove with a new confidence, a different energy than her usual tired commute. I followed her through familiar town landmarks. The high school, where we had first met at a Friday night football game, the old movie theater, where we had our first date, a double feature of some forgettable action flick, our church, its steeple a stark silhouette against the setting sun, where we had exchanged vows, promises whispered and believed. Each landmark felt less like a memory and more like a gravestone, marking the path to an impending doom I could almost taste. Her Honda Civic turned left onto Highway 12, then right onto a gravel road. And there it was, exactly as I had feared. The Iron Horse Bar and Grill. It was a squat, brick building, its neon sign flickering a dim red. Motorcycles, gleaming chrome and dark leather, were parked at odd angles outside, catching the last rays of the setting sun. My Betty Jo's neat, sensible Honda Civic looked utterly out of place, a pristine pearl among rough-hewn stones. And I, in Pop's old pickup, felt just as out of place, a spectator to a life I didn't recognize. I pulled into the gravel lot of an abandoned gas station across the road, killing the engine. I watched her get out of her car, smooth her jeans, and walk toward the entrance. She hesitated for a second, then pushed open the heavy wooden door and disappeared inside. 15 minutes. I sat there, the steering wheel cold beneath my hands, counting the seconds, then the minutes. My breath was shallow. My mind was a whirlwind of calculations, possibilities, denials, but the image of her, transformed, walking into that bar, was undeniable. The numbers on my spreadsheet were suddenly alive, breathing, real. I took a deep breath, the stale air in the truck doing little to calm me. Real proof, I had told Gary. This was it. I got out of the truck, my legs feeling strangely heavy. I crossed the dusty road, the crunch of gravel under my feet loud in the quiet evening. I pushed open the same heavy wooden door. The darkness hit me first. A thick curtain against the twilight outside. Then the smell. Stale beer, old smoke, and something else. Something sharper, like desperation and cheap cologne. The air was thick, a cloying blanket that settled on my clothes, in my hair. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, picking out the forms of people. The glint of bottles behind the bar. The noise inside the Iron Horse was a physical assault. Country music, twangy and mournful, blared from unseen speakers, competing with the sharp crack of pool balls and the rough rumble of laughter. The air was thick, a potent cocktail of stale beer, cheap perfume, and cigarette smoke that stung my nostrils. My eyes struggled to adjust, blinking against the dim light that filtered through the haze. I scanned the room, my gaze sweeping past groups of men in leather vests, women with teased hair, and solitary figures hunched over drinks. And then I saw her. At the far end of the long, scuffed wooden bar, Betty Jo sat on a stool. She was not alone. A man, massive, a mountain in a black leather vest, had his arm draped casually around her waist, his hand resting on her hip. His back was mostly to me, but I could see the heavy set of his shoulders, the thick neck. Betty Jo was laughing, her head thrown back, a full-bodied, uninhibited laugh that I hadn't heard from her in months, maybe even years. It was a sound that twisted something inside me. A sharp, cold wrench. On the back of the man's vest, illuminated by the dim neon glow of a beer sign, I saw a patch. A snarling skull with jagged lightning bolts, and beneath it, in bold red letters, Red Thunder. "You lost, suit?" A gravelly voice rumbled beside me. I turned my head slowly. A man with a long, gray beard, wearing a similar leather vest, stood just inches away. His eyes, dark and heavy-lidded, scrutinized me, taking in my button-down shirt and sensible slacks. I hadn't even realized I was still wearing my work clothes. "No," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady, considering the tremor in my hands. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The biker's gaze followed mine across the room, settling on Betty Jo and the giant in the leather vest. A slow understanding dawned in his eyes, a glint of cruel amusement. A low chuckle escaped him. "Oh," he said, drawing out the word. "This ought to be good." "Hey, Miller! Got a visitor!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the country music. The mountain man, Butch Miller, turned slowly, his head swiveling. He had a scarred face, a close-cropped dark beard, and eyes that held no warmth, only a predatory gleam. He saw me, and a slow, humorless grin spread across his face, revealing a missing front tooth. His hand tightened on Betty Jo's waist. Betty Jo turned then, following Miller's gaze. Her eyes, so recently filled with carefree laughter, flashed through a rapid succession of emotions. First, surprise, a wide-eyed shock, then, fear. A quick flicker of panic, but then, to my utter bewilderment and terror, something else settled in. A strange, almost palpable sense of relief. "Ed," she said, her voice small, a fragile whisper against the bar's din. She didn't move from Butch Miller's grip. Her arm remained linked through his, her hand resting on his forearm. "What are you doing here?" I took a step forward, the crunch of spilled peanut shells under my shoes a surprisingly loud sound. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The air in my lungs felt thin, sharp, funny. I replied, my voice steady, though it felt distant, as if coming from someone else. "I was about to ask you the same thing." The words hung in the air, the country music suddenly seeming to fade, the clack of pool balls momentarily silenced. The silence, brief but profound, felt like the calm before a storm. Butch Miller's grin widened, and his grip on Betty Jo remained firm. "So this is the famous husband," Butch rumbled, his voice a low growl that filled the sudden quiet. It was as big as his biceps, which flexed under the leather. "The boring accountant who can't keep his woman satisfied." The words hung in the air, cold and calculated. Every eye in the bar seemed to be on me, On Betty Jo. On the scene unfolding. Betty Jo looked away, her cheeks flushed. Perhaps from embarrassment. Perhaps from the whiskey I could now faintly smell on her breath. Betty Jo, I said, my voice cutting through the tension, ignoring Butch entirely. We need to talk. Now. She finally met my gaze, and her eyes were hard, defiant. There's nothing to talk about, Ed, she snapped, her voice louder than I expected. I've been trying to tell you for months, but you never listen. You're so caught up in your numbers and your routines. I'm suffocating. Suffocating? I repeated, the word tasting bitter. Is that what you call sneaking around behind my back? Lying to my face? Is this what you call finding yourself? Betty Jo? I gestured vaguely at Butch, then around the dim, smoky bar. Butch Miller stood up then, slowly, deliberately. He was massive, easily 6'4", his frame a wall of muscle. His arms, bare beneath the sleeveless vest, were thicker than my thighs. He stepped around Betty Jo, placing himself between us, towering over me. Listen here, calculator, he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. The lady's made her choice. Why don't you take your spreadsheets and your hurt feelings and get the hell out of my bar? Something snapped inside me. Maybe it was the casual cruelty in his voice. Maybe it was Betty Jo's hand, still resting lightly on Butch's forearm, a gesture of quiet support, or maybe it was just the cumulative weight of months of doubt and pain crashing down all at once. The boring accountant, the calculator, that's what I was to them. Your bar. I laughed, a raw, bitter sound that felt out of place in the silent room. Is that what you call this money laundering operation? Or is that just a side hustle for you and your biker friends, Miller? Butch's face, already hard, darkened instantly. Betty Jo's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear finally replacing the defiance. She knew. She knew about this place. I saw the punch coming. It was a slow, powerful swing, not particularly fast. I didn't even try to dodge it. Maybe I wanted it. The fist connected with my jaw, a sickening crunch that rattled my teeth, sending a jolt of pain through my head. I reeled backward, stumbling over my own feet, and hit the grimy floor with a thud. The taste of copper bloomed in my mouth. Before I could even register the pain, a heavy boot connected with my ribs, driving the air from my lungs in a sharp gasp. I curled up, clutching my side, pain radiating through me. Get him out of here, Butch commanded, his voice booming. Rough hands, belonging to two other large men, grabbed me, one under each arm. They hauled me up, my feet dragging uselessly. I caught one last glimpse of Betty Jo. She stood by the bar, her hand clapped over her mouth, her eyes wide, but she made no move to stop them. No word, no gesture, nothing. They dragged me past the pool table, past the silent, staring faces, and through the heavy wooden door. They threw me, not gently, but like a sack of trash, onto the gravel parking lot. My head hit the ground first, then my shoulder. I lay there, tasting blood and shame, the sharp edges of the gravel digging into my cheek. The country music from inside was a faint, mocking echo. My phone, miraculously still in my pocket, buzzed against my leg. I fumbled for it, pulling it out with a trembling hand. The screen glowed in the dimming light. A text from Gary. How'd the surveillance go? I looked up at the vast, indifferent Midwestern sky, my jaw aching, my ribs throbbing, and then I started to laugh. A raw, broken sound that caught in my throat, half a sob, half a gurgle of blood. You want to know how life's costly choices unfold? Stick around to the end. The gravel bit into my cheek, and the metallic tang of blood filled my mouth. The laughter had died down, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Home was not an option. Not yet. Not with Betty Jo and that man. My jaw throbbed, a dull ache that mirrored the emptiness in my chest. I slowly pushed myself up, my ribs screaming a protest. The air was cool and crisp, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the bar. My reflection in the ranger's side mirror showed a swollen jaw, a smear of blood near my lip, and eyes that held a new, dangerous glint. I drove. Not toward my quiet house with the trimmed lawn, but toward the industrial park where Gary kept his real estate office. I had a spare key. A relic from a time when we used to help each other out with odd jobs or late-night paperwork. The office was dark, silent, smelling faintly of old coffee and dusty paper. I flipped on a desk lamp, its weak glow doing little to dispel the shadows. I pulled out my phone. It was almost midnight. There were 3 calls I needed to make. The first was to Brenda Hayes. She was my lawyer, primarily for tax issues, a sharp woman with a no-nonsense attitude and a reputation for meticulous detail. Her voicemail picked up. "Brenda," I said, my voice hoarse, "Ed Miller. I need to talk to you first thing in the morning. This isn't about taxes. This is personal. Very personal. And urgent." The second call was to Dale Peterson, my college roommate, a man who could drink a keg and still remember every detail of a federal tax code. He now worked for the IRS, somewhere deep in their investigative division. I knew he kept late hours. To my surprise, he answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. "Dale? It's Ed." A pause. "Ed? Jesus. You all right? You sound like you swallowed a sandpaper milkshake." "I'm fine," I lied, running a hand over my swollen jaw. "Listen, I have some information. About a bar. The Iron Horse. I think it might be of interest to your department. Very, very interesting." I gave him a few quick details, my accountant's mind already forming patterns, connecting dots, the information flowing out in a cool, detached stream. Dale listened, his initial grogginess replaced by a sharp, professional interest. He promised to look into it. The third call was the hardest. My pops. He lived in Florida now, enjoying his retirement. He was a good man, a tough man, and fiercely protective. He deserved peace. "Pops," I said, when he finally answered, his voice thick with sleep. "It's Ed. Eddie? What's wrong? You never call this late." "Betty Joe," I started, and the words caught in my throat. I swallowed hard, the pain in my jaw a sharp reminder. I recounted the evening, leaving out none of the humiliating details, the punch, the way they threw me out. Pops's voice, when he finally spoke, crackled with fury, even from hundreds of miles away. "They did what? That damn no-good son of a bitch. And Betty Joe just watched?" His outrage was a comfort, a familiar anchor in the storm. "It's okay, Pops," I said, though nothing was okay. "I'm handling it." "The hell you are," Pops growled. "I'm coming home. I'll be on the first flight out tomorrow morning." "No, stay there," I insisted, my voice firm. "I need to do this my way. This is my fight." I knew he would try to intervene, and his well-meaning but often hot-headed actions wouldn't help. This needed precision, calculation, my kind of fight. After hanging up, the quiet of the office settled around me once more. I pulled out my laptop, the screen a pale blue in the dim room. This was it. This was where I was truly in my element. I started typing, my fingers still a little stiff, but finding their rhythm. Following the money. That's what I did best. I began digging into public records for the Iron Horse. Business licenses, tax filings, property deeds. My eyes, though tired, picked apart the inconsistencies, the glaring anomalies. Underreported income, inflated expenses, a bewildering array of shell companies listed as owners. It was a mess. A screaming sign of intentional obfuscation to an accountant like me. No legitimate business was this sloppy, unless it was deliberately trying to hide something. By the time the first sliver of dawn broke through the blinds, casting faint light into the office, I had a clear idea. Butch Miller wasn't just running a dive bar and sleeping with my wife. He was running a sophisticated, albeit crude, money laundering operation. And I, Ed Miller, the boring accountant, now had a new ledger to balance. I walked past our bed, neatly made as always, a stark contrast to the chaos inside my head. The lingering scent of her perfume, a floral blend I had once found comforting, now felt like a betrayal. I opened the closet, pulling out a duffel bag from the shelf, and started to pack. A few shirts, a couple pairs of jeans, toiletries. Just the essentials. My movements were deliberate, precise, a stark counterpoint to the turmoil beneath the surface. Each fold of a shirt was an act of quiet defiance. I was halfway through folding a blue button-down when I heard the front door open, then close softly. Footsteps. Hesitant. They stopped at the threshold of our bedroom. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. I knew it was Betty Jo. She stood there, watching me. I could feel her presence, a warmth in the doorway. The air in the room, already heavy with unspoken words, thickened. The morning light filtered through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, forgotten particle of our life. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small, unfamiliar, devoid of its usual sharpness. I folded the shirt neatly, placed it in the bag. My hands, despite the throbbing in my jaw, were steady. "Does it matter?" I replied, my voice flat, not looking up. The scent of stale beer and another person's cheap cologne still clung to me, a physical manifestation of my answer. "Ed." She started, then stopped, struggling for words. A rare hesitation from her. I picked up a pair of socks, rolled them tight. "It's not why," she tried again, her voice trailing off, unable to complete the thought. I continued packing. The silence stretched between us, a chasm. I didn't ask her where she had been, or with whom. I didn't need to. The image of her, laughing in Butch Miller's arms, was seared into my memory, an indelible stain. My focus was singular now. The numbers, the proof, the systematic dismantling of the lies that had built up around me. Around us, Betty Jo shifted her weight, a nervous rustle of clothing. I could feel her eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine, settling on the dresser, the empty space beside my pillow, anywhere but my face. The life we had built here, the house, the furniture, the shared space, it all felt like a stage set after the play had ended. The actors gone, the applause long faded, leaving behind only the husks of what once was. I pulled the zipper on my duffel bag. The sound was loud in the stillness, a final, definitive closure. I stood up, the bag in my hand, my gaze finally meeting hers. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but there was no apology there. Only a lingering trace of that strange relief I had seen in the bar. A relief that the facade had finally broken. "I'll be at Gary's office," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Don't call." "I'll call you when I'm ready." I walked past her. The scent of her perfume clashing with the smell of my own bruised body and the metallic tang of dried blood that was still on my lip. She didn't move, didn't try to stop me. She just stood there, watching me go, a silent silhouette in the doorway of our crumbling life. She wanted to explain. I knew it. To rationalize her choices, to minimize the severity of her actions, to shift blame, perhaps even to me. But I was done listening to explanations, to justifications that had no basis in the facts. My ears were closed, and my mind was already calculating a new course, a new balance sheet. The ache in my jaw, the sharp pain in my ribs. They were not just injuries. They were tangible reminders of Butch Miller's casual violence. The raw, brutal reality of the world Betty Jo had stepped into, and they fueled a cold, hard resolve in me, a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. The spreadsheet in my mind, the one that had so meticulously tracked Betty Jo's movements and spending, was now tracing a different kind of balance. Justice. My calls to Brenda Hayes, my tax lawyer, and Dale Peterson, my old college roommate at the IRS, weren't about a quiet separation or a clean, amicable divorce. No, those calls were about consequences. They were about unraveling the illicit network that I had spent the early morning hours uncovering, the messy, convoluted finances of the Iron Horse. That bar, its underreported income, its shell companies, it was all a deliberate tangle, designed to obscure something far larger than selling overpriced beer. Pops's anger, his Midwestern father's protective fury, still resonated in my ears. I had redirected that raw emotion, channeled it into this precise, systematic plan. This wasn't just about my broken heart or my bruised body. It was about the principles I lived by, the order I believed in, the truth that I, as an accountant, was sworn to uphold. Betty Jo's betrayal, once a deeply personal wound, had become a doorway into something much larger and darker, a criminal enterprise that touched the edges of our quiet town, hidden in plain sight. My focus had expanded beyond the confines of our marriage, beyond the immediate pain. I understood now. The price of infidelity wasn't just a broken heart, not just a shattered home. It was a reckoning, not just for Betty Jo, for her choices, for the man she had chosen, not just for Butch Miller, for his violence and his criminal dealings, but for me too, for my complacency, for the truths I had ignored, for the life I had allowed to become so unbalanced. I had to balance the books, not just the financial ones, but the moral ones as well. I took one last breath of the air inside our home, an air that now felt foreign, heavy with the ghosts of shared meals and quiet evenings. I stepped past Betty Jo, not with anger, not with a raised voice or a dramatic exit. I moved with a cold, precise determination, each step measured. My hand found the doorknob, twisted it. The front door clicked shut behind me, a quiet, final sound in the morning stillness. It left Betty Jo alone in the quiet, shattered home, and me on the porch, facing a world that was suddenly much larger, much more dangerous, and entirely mine to navigate. I was staying at Gary's office. It wasn't much, just a small cot Gary kept in the back room for late nights. But it was functional. The duffel bag, hastily packed, now sat in the corner, its contents a stark reminder of the home I had left behind. The office smelled of old paper and lukewarm coffee, a scent that was quickly becoming my new normal. My jaw still ached. A dull, persistent throb that occasionally flared with a sharp pain when I moved it wrong. The bruises on my ribs were a mottled blue and green, slowly fading, but they were a constant, physical reminder of Butch Miller's disregard, a tangible wound fueling an intangible resolve. I had showered, changed into clean clothes from the duffel bag, and tried to establish a new routine, however temporary. Brenda Hayes called me back late that first morning. Her voice, crisp and professional, cut through the quiet of the office. "Ed, you sounded urgent. What's going on?" I laid it out for her, in the precise, factual manner that was second nature to me. The iron horse, the receipt, Betty Jo, Butch Miller. And then, the numbers, the public records, the inconsistencies, the clear signs of money laundering. I could almost hear her making notes on the other end of the line. "Ed," she said, after a long pause, "this is far more complex than a standard divorce. If what you're saying about the bar is true, we're talking about federal offenses. This is serious, potentially dangerous territory." Her voice held a note of caution, but also a professional intrigue. "Meet me at my office tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Bring everything you have." I spent the rest of that day, and much of the night, at the desk, hunched over my laptop, the screen illuminating my grim face. My spreadsheet, Project Echo, grew exponentially. I cross-referenced names, addresses, LLC registrations. The network was larger than I'd first thought, a tangled web of shell corporations and straw owners, all leading back, indirectly, to the Iron Horse and a few key individuals. Dale Peterson called me back the next afternoon. His voice, usually jovial, was now laced with a serious edge. "Ed, you weren't kidding. My people are already digging. The Iron Horse has been on the fringes of our radar for a while, but nothing concrete enough to move on. Your information, especially the details on those recent transfers and the inflated inventory reports. That's gold. Real gold." "What does that mean, Dale?" I asked, my voice flat. "It means you've stumbled into something big. Bigger than your wife's infidelity, certainly. These aren't just small-time thugs. These are people who don't like their business messed with. You need to be careful, Ed. Very careful." The warning resonated. I knew the danger was real, but the pursuit of truth, of balance, was a more powerful drive than fear. My days had taken on a new rhythm: wake, Research, call, analyze. The small office became my bunker, my war room. The cot in the back, my austere bed. Betty Jo hadn't called. I hadn't expected her to. And I hadn't called her. My phone, usually a conduit for the everyday pleasantries of married life, was now solely a tool for my investigation. I ate cold sandwiches, drank lukewarm coffee, and rarely left the office, except for quick runs to the convenience store across the street for more supplies. There was no emotional turmoil, not anymore. The initial shock, the humiliation, the pain, they had solidified into a cold, precise determination. My focus was singular. I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of necessity. A deep-seated need to correct the imbalance, to expose the lies, both personal and financial. The silence from Betty Jo was just another data point, confirming the depth of her involvement and the finality of our separation. I was systematically dismantling my old life, piece by careful piece, and constructing a new one, based on cold, hard facts. The week blurred into a continuous cycle of research and communication. My physical bruises were fading, but the internal marks, the ones carved by betrayal and violence, were solidifying into an unshakable resolve. The IRS and Brenda Hayes were moving, slowly but surely, like two tectonic plates shifting towards an inevitable collision. Brenda, true to her word, had already filed the initial paperwork for the divorce. My instructions were clear. No fault. As quick and clean as possible. I didn't want a messy fight over assets. Not yet. My focus was elsewhere, on the larger game, and I couldn't risk anything distracting from the investigation, or giving Betty Jo or Butch Miller any reason to complicate things further. "Are you sure, Ed?" Brenda had asked, her voice tinged with a rare note of concern. "No alimony? No claims on her part for your pension?" "Positive," I had replied. "Just get it done." The house, the savings, they felt irrelevant now. Pieces on a chessboard I was no longer playing. Gary, unaware of the full scope of what I was doing, sent me a text one evening. "Dude, still at my office? What's going on? You look like hell, man, and you're starting to smell like my old gym bag." I typed back a quick reply. "Just working a big case, Gary. Don't worry about it. Appreciate the couch." I knew he was genuinely concerned, but I couldn't involve him any deeper. The less he knew, the safer he was. He deserved to be out of the crossfire. My days continued in a relentless rhythm. I built elaborate flowcharts, detailing the flow of illicit money through the Iron Horse and its satellite businesses. I traced transactions, identified shell corporations, and pieced together a compelling narrative of tax evasion, fraud, and potentially even more serious crimes. My accounting skills, usually applied to mundane tax returns and corporate audits, were now bent towards dismantling a criminal enterprise. It was an intricate puzzle, and I was finding a strange, grim satisfaction in solving it. Dale Peterson and I were in frequent contact. He was impressed by the meticulous detail of my findings. "You've got a real knack for this, Ed," he'd said on a call. "You could have been an agent, just an accountant trying to balance the books," I'd replied, a wry twist to my mouth. He filled me in on their end. They were quietly building a case, confirming my information, preparing for a coordinated raid. "We're talking about a significant operation here, Ed," Dale warned. "These guys are tied in, got connections. You keep your head down. Don't go near that place. Don't confront anyone." I assured him I understood, but the truth was, a part of me, the part that was still bruised and betrayed, wanted a confrontation. Not a physical one, not again, but a strategic one. I wanted to see the look on Butch Miller's face when his carefully constructed house of cards came tumbling down. I wanted to see Betty Jo witness it. The silence from Betty Jo was absolute. No calls, no texts, no attempts at communication. It confirmed everything I needed to know. The relief I had seen in her eyes at the bar was not fleeting. It was genuine. She had chosen. And now, she was living with that choice. The emotional cost was immense. Sometimes, in the quiet solitude of the office late at night, a wave of sadness would wash over me, a chilling reminder of the life that was gone, the man I used to be, but I pushed it down, deep inside, replacing it with the cold, detached logic of my work. This was my path now, and I would see it through. The confrontation, the real one, was coming. And this time, I would be prepared. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text. It wasn't Gary. It was Pops. Thinking of you, son. Love you. No anger, no questions, just a simple message of unwavering support. It was a lifeline. A quiet reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. Even as I navigated this solitary path, I texted back, "Love you too, Pops." It was all I could manage, all that was needed. The work culminated in a final, joint meeting with Brenda Hayes and Dale Peterson. We met in a sterile conference room in Brenda's downtown office. I spread out my binders, my printed spreadsheets, my flowcharts. It was a comprehensive map of the criminal enterprise, from the petty cash skimming to the complex web of shell corporations. The names, the dates, the amounts, it was all there, meticulously documented. Brenda reviewed the legal aspects, nodding, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Dale, representing the IRS, leaned forward, his expression grim but impressed. "This is it, Ed," he said, tapping a finger on a printout of the Iron Horse's falsified income statements. "We're moving. We've coordinated with local law enforcement. It'll be a joint operation." Next Tuesday, just after closing, a cold, surgical anticipation settled in my gut. Next Tuesday. The day of reckoning. "Ed, you need to stay far away from this," Dale warned, his voice serious. "There could be violence. These individuals, they're not going to go down quietly." "I understand," I replied, my voice calm, but I knew I couldn't stay away. I needed to see it. I needed to witness the systematic dismantling of the lies that had fractured my life. It wasn't about revenge in the raw, emotional sense. It was about balance, about seeing the numbers finally add up. Brenda gave me a long, assessing look. "The divorce papers are moving forward. She hasn't responded to the initial filings. Standard procedure. For now, but once this goes down, things could get complicated." I nodded. Complicated. That was an accountant's word for messy. I was prepared for messy. Later that day, on my way back to Gary's office, I took a detour. I drove past my old house, the one with the trimmed lawn and the porch swing. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows. Betty Jo's Honda Civic was in the driveway, and beside it, unmistakable, was Butch Miller's black motorcycle, gleaming dully in the light. I didn't slow down. I didn't feel the familiar pang of pain or anger. Just a quiet confirmation. She had made her choice, and now she was living it. The sight solidified my resolve, if it needed any further strengthening. My old life, the one I had shared with Betty Jo, was gone, eradicated, replaced by this new reality. Cold and hard and clear. I was ready. Ready for the inevitable fallout. Ready for the next phase. The silence from Betty Jo was just a confirmation of the path I had chosen, the solitude I now embraced. My mind was a steel trap, my emotions locked down. The scales were tipping. Soon, they would balance. The days leading up to Tuesday were a slow, methodical march. I continued my routine at Gary's office, refining my notes, double-checking every figure, every name. The anticipation was a quiet hum beneath the surface, a steady thrum that sharpened my focus. I reached out to Gary on Monday afternoon. "Hey, you free for dinner Tuesday night?" "My treat. Someplace not Murphy's, though. I'm thinking that new Italian place, the Olive Tree, downtown." Gary, bless his oblivious heart, readily agreed. "Sure, man. Glad to see you getting out of the office. What time, say, around 9:30? I suggested, knowing full well the raid was scheduled for just after the bar closed, which would be around midnight. This would give me ample time to get into position without suspicion, and a convenient excuse if Gary wondered why I was in the area. Tuesday. The day arrived with an ordinary, Midwestern crispness. The sky was a pale blue, the air cool. I spent the morning going over my files one last time, ensuring every detail was accessible, every piece of evidence cross-referenced. The meticulousness was a comfort, a shield against the rising tide of anticipation. As evening approached, I showered, shaved, and put on a clean, dark shirt and jeans. Not my work clothes, but something that wouldn't stand out. I packed the binoculars, still pristine from their Target purchase, into a small backpack, along with a bottle of water and a granola bar. Old habits die hard. I took Pop's old pickup truck. It was inconspicuous. A familiar sight on these roads. I drove out to the Iron Horse, not to the main parking lot, but to the same abandoned hardware store lot across the street, the one where I had first begun my surveillance of Betty Jo. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in hues of deep orange and purple. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of drying leaves. I parked in a shadowed corner, the truck's engine cooling with a series of quiet ticks. I felt a strange mix of apprehension and grim satisfaction. This was it, the culmination of weeks of silent observation, of painful discovery, of methodical investigation. Slowly, the parking lot of the Iron Horse began to fill. Motorcycles, pickup trucks, a few older sedans, familiar faces, men in leather vests, women in tight jeans, the usual crowd. And then, at just past 9 p.m., Betty Jo's Honda Civic pulled in. Close behind it, Butch Miller's distinctive black motorcycle. She got out, smoothed her black crop top. Her hair was down, styled, as it had been that first night. There was a subtle hardness to her expression, something I hadn't seen before, a kind of weary resignation that had replaced the casual defiance. Butch dismounted his motorcycle, walked around, and placed a casual hand on the small of her back as they walked toward the bar entrance. The easy familiarity, the quiet comfort between them, confirmed everything. It confirmed her choice, solidified my emotional detachment. There was no more pain, just a quiet, almost scientific observation. I glanced at my watch. 9:15 p.m. Less than 3 hours. I adjusted the binoculars, bringing the entrance of the Iron Horse into sharp focus. The neon sign flickered, casting a dim red glow on the weathered brick. I settled in, my breathing shallow, my heart beating a steady, controlled rhythm. I was ready to watch the final act unfold. The weight was a taut wire, stretching thinner and thinner with each passing minute. The music from the Iron Horse was a dull throb in the night, barely audible from my vantage point. I watched the bar, a silent observer in the darkness, the binoculars a cold extension of my gaze. The clock on the Ranger's dashboard crept past 11:30 p.m., then 11:45 p.m. The last stragglers began to trickle out of the Iron Horse. I recognized a few faces from my first visit, including the gray-bearded biker who had first accosted me. They dispersed into the night, their motorcycles roaring to life, their pickup trucks rumbling away. Finally, just before midnight, Butch Miller emerged, followed by Betty Jo. He locked the heavy wooden door behind them with a clunk that carried faintly across the road. He said something to her, his hand briefly touching her cheek. She smiled, a small, weary smile, and then turned toward her Honda Civic. Butch watched her for a moment, then went back inside, presumably to finish whatever last-minute tasks a bar owner performs after closing. Betty Jo got into her car, the interior light briefly illuminating her face. She started the engine, the low hum barely audible. But she didn't pull out. She just sat there, the car idling, facing the entrance of the bar. Precisely at midnight, as if on cue, the night shattered. From every direction, unmarked black sedans and vans, moving with an almost military precision, converged on the Iron Horse. Lights flashed, sirens, initially muted, then blaring, cut through the quiet of the night. Federal agents, their vests emblazoned with IRS Criminal Investigation and local sheriff's department, poured out of the vehicles. They moved fast, a blur of dark uniforms and official purpose. One team breached the front door of the Iron Horse with a battering ram, the crash echoing across the road. Another group swarmed around the back. Local patrol cars, with their flashing blue and red lights, blocked off Highway 12 inches both directions, securing the perimeter. I watched through the binoculars, a grim satisfaction settling over me. It was unfolding exactly as Dale Peterson had described, exactly as I had helped plan, the culmination of weeks of work, of all those late nights hunched over my laptop, of all those precise calculations. The numbers were finally adding up. Then, I shifted the binoculars. My gaze went to Betty Jo's Civic. It was still idling in the parking lot, bathed in the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands on the steering wheel, her face illuminated by the chaotic light show. I could almost feel her shock, her disbelief, even from my distant vantage point. She was a deer in headlights, caught in the sudden, blinding glare of a truth she had helped to construct. She had stayed. She had chosen to wait for Butch. And now, she was witnessing the full, undeniable consequences of those choices. The silence from her for weeks had been a choice. The laughter in Butch's arms had been a choice. And now, the raid, the federal agents, the flashing lights, they were all consequences. My presence was a silent testament, a final, unobserved accounting. I had seen her go in. I had seen her wait. And now, I was seeing it all come crashing down, the careful, systematic dismantling. This was the balance I had sought. The raid unfolded with brutal efficiency. Agents swarmed the building, pulling out individuals in various states of surprise and disarray. Butch Miller was among the first to be brought out, his large frame dwarfed by the combined force of 2 federal agents. His face was a mask of furious disbelief, his eyes darting frantically across the chaotic scene. I watched through the binoculars as they brought Butch Miller out. His large frame, usually so imposing, seemed to shrink under the firm grip of 2 federal agents. His face was a mask of furious disbelief, his eyes darting frantically across the chaotic scene, searching for an escape, for a way to explain this away. He was handcuffed, his hands behind his back, his swagger replaced by a helpless fury. One by one, other individuals, men and women from inside the bar, were brought out, identified, handcuffed, and led to waiting patrol cars. The country music was silenced, replaced by the crackle of police radios, the shouts of agents, and the distant wail of more sirens. My gaze, however, remained mostly fixed on Betty Jo's Civic. She was still in the driver's seat, the engine still idling. Her face, illuminated by the flashing emergency lights, was frozen in an expression of shock, her eyes wide, her hands clenched white on the steering wheel. She hadn't moved since the first wave of agents descended. Then, a local sheriff's deputy, a young man I vaguely recognized from high school, approached her car. He tapped on her window. Betty Jo flinched, then slowly, with trembling fingers, lowered the window. I couldn't hear their exchange from my distance, but I could see her lips moving, her head shaking slowly. The deputy listened, then shone his flashlight into her car, briefly illuminating the interior. He gestured toward the chaotic scene at the Iron Horse, his hand sweeping across the flashing lights and the huddle of agents. Betty Jo looked, and then a profound, utter defeat settled over her face. She slowly nodded. The deputy opened her door, spoke to her again, and then, gently but firmly, escorted her out of the Civic. She didn't resist. Her shoulders slumped. She walked with the deputy toward a waiting patrol car, her head down. It wasn't just Butch Miller. It wasn't just the bar. Betty Jo was implicated. She wasn't just a bystander, a casual observer of her lover's criminal enterprise. She was part of it, in some capacity, however small. The realization wasn't a shock. It was just another data point, a final balance to the ledger of her choices. A profound sense of finality washed over me. The last vestiges of my old life, the life I had shared with Betty Jo, dissolved into the cold night air. There was no room for sentimentality, no space for regret, just the grim satisfaction of seeing justice unfold, of seeing the numbers finally add up, accurately and irrevocably. The truth, painstakingly uncovered, was now laid bare for all to see. I watched as Betty Jo was gently placed in the back of the patrol car, the door closing with a soft click. The flashing lights continued their silent dance, casting long, distorted shadows across the gravel. My work here was done. I slowly started the Ranger, its old engine rumbling to life. I pulled out of the abandoned lot, merging onto the now quiet highway, leaving the flashing lights and the unfolding chaos behind me. No one noticed my departure. I left no trace, just the cold, hard facts, now laid bare. I met Gary at the olive tree an hour later. He was already at a table, looking bored and a little agitated. "Ed!" "Finally," he said, waving me over. "What took you so long? I was about to think you stood me up. Traffic was bad." I lied smoothly, sliding into the booth seat across from him. "And you know Pop's truck isn't exactly a speed demon." "Sorry to keep you waiting." Gary waved his hand, dismissing it. "No worries. I just ordered a beer." "You want one?" "Water for me," I said, my voice calm. The adrenaline from the raid was slowly receding, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion. We ordered. Gary prattled on about a difficult client, a new listing he was excited about. I listened, nodded, offered appropriate comments. It was all so mundane, so normal, a stark contrast to the flashing lights and federal agents I had just left behind. He had no idea. The thought was a strange comfort. Then, inevitably, he brought her up. "So, about Betty Jo," Gary said, taking a sip of his beer. "You heard from her? She's still not answering your calls?" I picked at a loose thread on the tablecloth. "No," I replied, my voice even detached. "Haven't spoken to her in a while. I imagine she's busy." Gary gave me a concerned look. "Ed, this isn't good. She's your wife. You two need to talk this out." "She's probably just feeling overwhelmed." I just nodded, offering no explanation, no details. The profound silence from Betty Jo, unbroken for weeks, was no longer a source of pain. It was a confirmation, a clear end. There was nothing to talk out. The conversation had been had, in the language of actions and consequences. We talked about other things then. The local high school football team, the rising price of gas. I watched Gary, his easygoing nature, his obliviousness, and felt a quiet, unshakable peace settle over me. The emotional wreckage was in the past. The future, though uncertain, was mine alone to construct. The food arrived, hot and steaming. I ate slowly, savoring the blandness of the pasta, the lack of any strong flavor. It was a clean taste, a fresh start. The bitterness, the anger, the sharp tang of betrayal that had been processed, accounted for, balanced. I knew Betty Jo would eventually call, or Brenda would contact me with news from her lawyer. But that would be a different chapter. A legal formality. The emotional chapter was closed, the moral one balanced. When the meal was done, I insisted on paying, despite Gary's protests. "My treat," I repeated. "Thanks for the company, Gary." "Needed a break from all my numbers," he chuckled, none the wiser. "Anytime, buddy. Just don't wait so long next time, all right?" "I won't," I promised. I dropped Gary off at his place, then drove back to the office. The cot in the back room felt less like a temporary solution and more like a chosen path. The silence was not empty. It was full of possibilities. The consequences of betrayal were now in motion, irreversible. And I, the boring accountant, was finally, truly, free. The days that followed the raid were filled with a different kind of intensity. My phone, once mostly silent, now buzzed with calls from Brenda Hayes and Dale Peterson. The process of legal and criminal proceedings was underway, a slow-moving but relentless machine. Brenda informed me that Butch Miller, Randy Larson, was facing serious federal charges for tax evasion, money laundering, and likely other associated criminal activities. The investigation was ongoing, but the evidence I had provided, coupled with the raid, had been decisive. He was in deep trouble. Betty Jo was also facing legal consequences. Her exact charges weren't fully clear yet, but her association with Miller and her presence at the bar during the raid, combined with any inconsistencies in her own tax filings or statements, meant she was implicated. She was represented by a public defender. And Brenda was handling the final stages of our divorce with minimal contact. The divorce was proceeding quickly, as I had wished. Pops called me, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. "Heard about it on the news, son. Big raid. IRS. Good work, Eddie. Proud of you. There was no anger, just a quiet understanding, a father's pride. Now, he continued, it's time to move forward. For you, don't look back. I took his advice to heart. My accounting practice, once routine, now had a new edge. I applied my skills with a renewed focus, a meticulous attention to detail that served me well. I was good at this, better than I had ever realized. The house, the symbol of my old life, went up for sale. It sold quickly to a young couple eager for a fresh start. The money, combined with my savings, allowed me to buy a small, functional apartment in a town a few hours away. A place where no one knew my history, where every street was new. I moved in with just the essentials, my clothes, my laptop, a few books. No photographs, no mementos of a past that no longer served me. The silence in the new apartment was different. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of my old home, but a quiet, almost expectant hush, filled with the possibility of new beginnings. I had learned a profound lesson about balance, about the high cost of emotional and financial imbalance. The scars from the betrayal and the violence remained. But they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders, etched into my being, of the person I had been, and the person I was becoming. My future was clear. It was built on precision, honesty, and a calculated detachment from the emotional chaos that had once consumed me. I had paid the price for truth, and while it had been a painful journey, it had ultimately led me to a stronger, more authentic self. My ledger was finally balanced, my mind clear, and I stood ready for whatever life brought next. The raw aftermath of betrayal and violence, the cold shock of a life upended. These moments aren't about emotion, they're about choices. My choice, in the quiet aftermath of that night, was to calculate, to quantify, to balance the ledger. I had witnessed the unraveling of my marriage, not as a passive observer, but as a meticulous architect of its truth. Linda, Randy Larson, the Iron Horse, they were all figures in an equation that had to resolve. The legal proceedings, the quiet sale of the house, the move to a new town where every street was unknown and every face unfamiliar. These were not acts of anger, but steps in a systematic process. I had sought justice, not revenge. I had pursued truth, not retribution. My life, stripped bare of sentimentality, now operated on the stark, clear principles of a balance sheet. Some might call it cold. I called it necessary. It was the only way to move forward. To build a life where the numbers, finally, added up.